We are going to start at center back, and we are going to stitch from center back towards the tip of the collar and then down towards the neckline edge, and then do the same thing on the other side going from center back. So I will start in the middle of my back here. There's the notch. I'm going to go just past the notch, drop my needle in position. Now, because I have eased this and pulled it, I need to apply some pressure front and back as I stitch, holding on to the collar and the collar facing, holding on to that stretch and keeping that ease so that I don't wind up with a tuck as I'm sewing. And so from pin to pin, I will go back again, put that hand behind, applying a little bit of pressure as I sew. Heading towards the tip here. You've got to be careful that you don't let the ease sew off the edge of the tip, so be sure you hold on to that tight. As you approach the tip, because we're going to have to trim and grade very closely, you are going to change your stitch length and go down to a reinforcement stitch. And so I've gone down to reinforcement. I continue to sew towards the tip here. Now, instead of just literally picking the presser foot up and pivot turning and heading down the other side, there's going to be a lot of fabric that has to get into that narrow tip. You will actually get a nicer tip and a better look if you will turn it, go at 45 degrees, and you're going to take one stitch diagonally across the tip of that collar. Okay? If your fabric is bulky, you may need to take 2 stitches. As you're sewing down this last side here, and I'll do the 2 sides differently so you can see, remember my 5/8 of an inch is 5/8 of an inch from my collar, which is the top one. I pulled the collar band, or the collar facing, out 1/8 of an inch, and so that is why I'm now lined up here, back there at 6/8, or the one line past 5/8, as I'm coming back. And so you can, as you're heading down, line up that direction. And I've gone 1/2 inch. I'm going to go ahead and go back to regulation stitch, holding in front and behind as I sew, keeping that little bit of pressure on. Come towards the edge and back stitch at that edge. Okay. The other thing that you can do, pull this down, yeah, okay. If you don't like sewing along the 6/8, after you've pulled that edge out, you can just simply go back now and trim the undercollar or the collar facing so that it matches up or is the same length as the upper collar or your fashion fabric, the piece that was interfaced. And by trimming that, now I can simply line up and sew at 5/8 on both sides. And so either one of those techniques are correct. You can do whichever one works best for you. As you go down the other side, you have 2 choices. You can reverse and sew along the stitch plate or along the guideline on the outside of your stitch plate, which will allow you still to sew with the collar side up. If that bothers you, your other option is to turn it over and you'll sew still along your first 5/8 line, and it allows you to sew on the side of the stitch plate that you are probably more used to sewing, but now you are sewing collar facing up as opposed to collar up. Okay? Either one again works. It's whatever you're most comfortable with. I'm going to go ahead and sew on the outside edge. Line that up. You'll notice that I'm going to go back over the top of my stitching just a little bit. Now, I am using a contrasting thread. I'm doing that on purpose so that you can see the thread easily on the interfacing and see the thread easily on the fabric. You will probably choose one that matches a little bit better. If I sew back over the top of my stitches, I can just take a couple and take one little back stitch. Now my first threads from sewing the opposite side there are secured by the fact that I just sewed over the top of them. And I didn't have to have 2 rows of back stitching sitting right on top of each other or right next to each other, which would make a fairly bulky section on the back of my collar. Doing the same thing, just applying some pressure, pulling on that collar as I sew, so that that ease comes in. Again, as I approach the tip of this collar, I'm going to go back down to reinforcement stitching. And remember, I trimmed this side, so when I turn, and I've got this, I want to be able to line up at 5/8, so I'm about where I want to be then. I'm going to take again that 1 stitch diagonally, and when I turn it, I'm exactly lined up on 5/8 of an inch. Give this fabric a pull. Go about 1/2 inch with reinforcement stitching, head back to regulation. The reason we do the reinforcement stitching at the tip of that collar is that it's going to get trimmed and graded very, very closely. And we've got to be able to reduce the seam allowance and not have it wind up fraying out. So we stitch down, back stitch.